Hello, my name is Nate Marshall, and I'm doing the Black Power movement for my author discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the discussion points that I'm going to go over. So this is how the movement began, um, the history, the impact on society, important people, important organizations, the influence on literature, some important authors, analysis of literature and themes, and then some influences on today, to give a really broad overview of what the period was about. All right, so at the beginning. So the civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael is the person who coined the phrase Black Power. During a speech, he said, "What we need is Black Power," and what he meant by this is um, African Americans need to be empowered by the pride of being African American. And that's what really made the phrase grow in popularity. It represented the need for African Americans to be proud of their African American descent. Um, Soon, Black Power came to represent a fight against racism in America, and that started with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and they started off as students, basically coordinating nonviolent protests. But they were very influenced by the leader Carmichael, and they started using more violent methods uh, in their protests, and that was due to this movement that Carmichael started. And the Black Power movement was also strongly influenced by Malcolm X, as we'll see later on in the presentation. So the history and impact. The Black Power movement started in the early 1960s as the civil rights movement began to peak and continued into the 1970s. And it should be noted that the civil rights movement is really what made the Black Power movement possible. It was a branch of the civil rights movement that was, again, more of a prideful um, movement within it. Now, originally, the movement was represented by the Black Panther, and another one was the fist raised in the air was another symbol for Black Power. The Black Arts era was born out of Black Power ideals, and the Black Power movement is mostly remembered for the violent rebellion that African Americans took part in, because there was a very large backlash, violent backlash by people within the Black Power movement against the racist America that was happening. Black Power was a way for African Americans to show their pride and to fight back directly against the injustices that were happening against them, because they were absolutely terrible. The African Americans that within this movement decided, it's not okay for us to be treated this way, and this isn't a long-term project. It's something that needs to happen right now, and that's why they decided to act on it. And so some important people, Malcolm X, and to many people he's considered the antithesis of Martin Luther King Jr. because Martin Luther King Jr. had so much to do with the nonviolent protesting, but Malcolm X disagreed with him in that aspect, is that we shouldn't necessarily be nonviolent. Um, Now I'll explain that through these quotes that I have here, because I think the words that he says create a very obvious sense of how he feels about the situation that African Americans were in at the time. A little background on him: he was a black nationalist and practiced the religion of Islam. And so here are his quotes: "We are nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. Concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks. And if you're not ready to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary." So you can kind of see from this that not only was he willing to fight to the death for his freedom against racism, he wanted everyone else to also feel that way. And that was a direct influence on the Black Power movement. That this isn't something we can wait on. We need to fight for our freedom right now. And Malcolm X was eventually assassinated. Another person was Rob Williams. He actively spoke for African Americans to arm themselves against racist whites, and he was a member of the NAACP, the NRA, and he founded the Black Guards, and that was essentially an armed force of African Americans that would fight against injustices against them. The Black Power movement was influenced by Rob Williams, but he eventually decided not to be a leader associated with the movement. So he was just an influence on the Black Power movement. And so some important organizations. Now, the Black Panthers are they're really the cornerstone of the movement. They were founded in 1966, soon after the Black Power movement started, by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, and they were a political party fighting for the ideals of the Black Power movement, essentially freedom and end of segregation right now, and they were willing to do it through force if force was taken upon them. They carried weapons, they wore black leather and black berets, and you can imagine that's a very serious uniform that they wore. They meant business, and if something violent was going to happen to African Americans, they were going to be there to fight back. So they led some rebellions, and especially against police officers that for the police brutality. That was one of the reasons that they actually were started. And they also were started right after Malcolm X was assassinated. And we'll notice this throughout African American history, is that when people are assassinated, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, it inspires a lot of people. So some other important organizations were the SNCC, again, which I already discussed, and the White Panther Party, which was a group of white people who agreed with the Black Panther values. And so influences on literature, which is essentially what this course is about, the Black arts movement was strongly influenced by the Black Power movement, and the other way around as well. So the Black Power movement pretty much gave birth to the Black arts movement. Literature that's influenced by the Black Power movement would reflect the movement's ideals. As we've seen in this course, that's a very common theme. The writing and the stories of the day reflect what's happening to African Americans in America during that time. So in this case, the fight against racial injustice and segregation were the events taking place in America, and the Black Power movement for the pride of African Americans was something that you would also see within the stories. So some important authors. I mentioned Malcolm X because he was such a great orator. He had so many speeches that were very influential through the time. I think he was actually voted one of the top 10 most influential people of the 1900s by Time, but I don't have that in here. So obviously his ability to speak was very powerful for people. He also has an autobiography. He wrote it with the help of an editor. So the autobiography of Malcolm X, and we'll go over that a little bit more in a later slide. Larry Neal was a Black arts writer. He stated that Black art is the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the Black Power concept. And so we already see that this Black arts and Black Power movement are so very similar. One is essentially the art coming out of the Black Power movement, representing African Americans and the pride that they have. And so the literature, we'll start with the autobiography of Malcolm X by Malcolm X. And I have a picture of that book right there. So essentially, it goes through his childhood and then his early life and his early adulthood, where he's in New York. It goes through many of his relationships with women, both Black and white women, lower class and middle class. And it really describes the reason that he feels the way he does, and it describes the reasons why he acts the way he does. And that's essentially what the book is about, giving a background story to why he is the man that he is. Now it also describes his conversion to Islam and his pilgrimage he took. And he actually was assassinated before this book was released, and that was something that he actually said would happen. He said it was unlikely that he would that the book would be released before he was assassinated. And then the Black Arts Movement is basically a piece of work by Larry Neal describing the art that would be coming out of the Black Power movement. And then Don't Say Goodbye to the Pork Pie Hat by Larry Neal it's a general story about why we need to, or why African Americans needed to be proud of who they were. Don't say goodbye to the pork pie hat that you wear. Keep wearing it. Don't change yourself just because of the world that you're living in. As African Americans in this society, we need to stand together and be who we are, and we are African Americans. And that is obviously just a very impactful story about what the Black Power movement is about. And the themes, if you haven't realized it yet, are Black Pride. That was very obvious. The pride of being an African American. Explanations of fight against whites. So why there is even a fight against a white and racist America, and then hope as well. Hope for the end of segregation and the hope for freedom, and that is a very common theme I've found in the African American literatures that we've read so far. Is that there's always, or almost always, a little bit of hope in there for a better future, and that's why they do the things that they do. Now, influences on today. I'm sure most of us have seen the Black Panther film. The Black Panther comic was actually made not too long before the Black Panther political party came about, and that was something that was very interesting. Is the Black Panther comic book? They almost changed the name of it because of the Black Power or Black Panther political party, but they decided not to, even with the controversy. Black Lives Matter has very direct connections to how the Black Power movement impacted people today. Be proud of your African American descent and who you are. Now, police brutality protests. Even today, we still have police brutality against minorities, and that is something that the Black Panther movement or the Black Panther Party actually fought against, was police brutality. And then in rap today, a lot of African American artists rap about the stories that relate to the Black Power movement, being African American, what it's like to be African American, and why you should be proud to be African American. And then here are my references. So that basically wraps it all up. Black Power movement. That's my author discussion. Thank you.